Good morning. Today we are continuing with chapter 5 in our religion book. We are continuing learning about the Old Testament. Yesterday we started with the Pentateuch. Who remembers what Pentateuch means? Tristan?
Well, I know Penta means 5, but 5 what?
So Penta, you're right, means 5. So Pentateuch, who remembers what the Took means? Pentateuch. Peyton.
Scrolls.
Yeah, the 5 scrolls, that the containers of the scrolls. So Pentateuch literally means the 5 containers of scrolls. Because back in the day, they used to write on scrolls instead of on the paper books like we have now. So Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Bible. After those first 5 books comes the historical books. So we know the first 5 books, the Pentateuch is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So before we move into the historical books, who can remind me what Genesis is about? Peyton.
Adam and Eve and creation.
Yeah, Adam and Eve and creation and those stories that came right after. All the way up to Joseph going into Egypt, the Israelites going into Egypt because of the famine. So then we come to Exodus. What does Exodus mean, Josie? Yeah, Exodus is exiting. They left Egypt. They escaped from Egypt because they were put into slavery. So Exodus is the exiting out of Egypt, the escaping that slavery. What is Leviticus about? Leviticus, Will? Yeah, so Leviticus is the laws. Leviticus laws. Okay, so it's to help you remember these key things to help us remember. Numbers. What happens in Numbers, Tristan?
The telling of the successes and the mistakes.
Yeah, Numbers is the counting of the people in the census. Moses counted all of the Israelites he had with him in the desert, and it's counting of the successes and the failures of them trying to get into the promised land. And then the last one is Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy, what did we think that kind of reminded us of, Peyton?
The end.
The end. Deuteronomy kind of sounds like ending. Okay, it's got that D in there. So Deuteronomy is the ending, the final words of Moses. So that Deuteronomy is when Moses leaves the chosen people, when he finally leaves them, that's Deuteronomy. Okay, so that brings us to our historical books. So let's look at the historical books on page 56. So we're going to start on page 56. The second section of the Old Testament contains the historical books from Joshua to 2nd Maccabees. This label can be misleading because these are not books of pure history. Most describe historical people and events, but they are written to emphasize God's actions in history, something modern history books never do. The historical books from the largest section of the Old Testament, the historical books form the largest section of the Old Testament. So if we looked back at the beginning of this chapter on page 52, we can see that there are 16 historical books in the Old Testament. The books of the prophets actually have 18, but I think those books are shorter. They're smaller. So the historical books are the largest section. They're much thicker books. For now, let's focus on a few key people and events described in the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. The history told in these books starts immediately after Exodus, when the chosen people entered the promised land. They were led by Joshua, whom God appointed to lead the people after Moses died. Joshua was a wise and faithful man and also a skilled warrior. You can read about him in the book of Joshua. Imagine that. Under Joshua's leadership, the Israelites conquered the promised land called Canaan or Israel, and divided it among the Israelite tribes. Joshua is famous for having said, "As for my family and me, we will serve the Lord." And you can read that phrase in Joshua chapter 24, verse 15. After Joshua's death, the chosen people did not have a king or appointed leader. But whenever trouble came, God raised up a spirit-filled leader who helped them fight off the threat. These leaders were called judges, and their stories are told in the book of Judges. So in the book of Joshua, we read about Joshua. In the book of Judges, we read about these leaders, the judges. One of the judges was a famous woman named Deborah, and you can read about her in chapter 4 of Judges. She led people to victory against a Canaanite general named Sisera. Another famous judge was Samson. Does anybody know the story of Samson? Ooh, you think you know it, Peyton?
Isn't it like when God was? I think I might be thinking
Go,
the wrong
give it a
one.
try.
But isn't it when God was like talking to him, and then he went to his master or something like that? That's
not what I'm thinking about with Samson. Samson was this really strong and powerful leader, but all of his power he got from his long hair. And the enemy got to his, I believe Delilah was his wife or his girlfriend, and they bought her. They gave her money so she would cut his hair.
Oh, I heard that.
And when his hair got cut, he lost all of his strength. And then they were able to conquer the city, and then there's a whole huge story about it. But Samson is the big, strong warrior, but when his hair got cut, he lost his power. So when you hear the song Hallelujah, how many of us know that song? Hallelujah. So they talk about Samson in that song. So I always think of it when I hear that song. I think of that story because they talk about Delilah cutting his hair. So I digress. Going back. Samson was very strong, but he was also sinful and broke many commitments to God. After Samson was captured by his enemies, because she cut his hair, God gave him one last chance to destroy them, but doing so cost Samson his life. So he sacrificed himself to help his people. That story is in Judges chapters 13 to 16. The last judge of Israel was Samuel. He was also a priest and a prophet and has 2 books of the Bible named after him, the 1st and 2nd Samuel. During the time of Samuel, the people wanted a king. They believed a king would offer the nation more protection and also more importance. God told Samuel to do as the people asked, so Samuel anointed Saul as the first king of Israel. See 1 Samuel chapter, it's 8 to 10. At first, Saul seemed like a good king, but he turned out to lack a strong faith in God. So God had Samuel anoint a young man named David to succeed Saul as king. David turned out to be a very good king, the best known king of Israel. See 1 Samuel chapters 16 to 19, 2 Samuel chapters 2 to 8. But not even David was perfect. We are all human. So David seemed like this amazing king, but he still had humanity in him. He has flaws. We sin. It's in our nature. He committed several serious sins during his years as king. Still, he was also a model of servant leadership in repenting for his sins and serving his people. See 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12. After David's death, Solomon, his son, became king. Solomon asked God for wisdom to rule the chosen people justly. God granted Solomon not only wisdom, but also wealth and a long life. See 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon built a beautiful temple for God in the capital city of Jerusalem. So that's in 1 Kings chapters 5 to 8. But like his father, Solomon also committed some serious sins. especially the sin of idolatry. What is the sin of idolatry?
Oh, I know.
What do you think, Tristan?
Worshiping something other than God.
Yeah, worshiping idols, false gods. So he was worshiping idols that he was not worshiping God. So that's a very serious sin. Think about the 10 Commandments. Okay, so that's breaking that commandment. After Solomon's death, civil war split the kingdom of Israel into two separate kingdoms. The northern kingdom was now called Israel, and the southern kingdom was called Judah. So we can read about that in 1 Kings.
Is it Judah?
That's Judah. Okay, because Judea has an E in it. So this is Judah. The stories of many less famous kings are told in 1st and 2nd Kings. 19 kings in the kingdom of Israel and 19 more in the kingdom of Judah. Most of these kings were sinful in the eyes of God. Because why?
Because they worship false gods.
Or because they're human. So there's no perfect human. Okay? Jesus was divine. All humans make mistakes. They have sins. Okay, so these kings were not perfect kings, and a lot of them made some very serious mistakes because along with great power comes great responsibility. And sometimes people make those really bad choices because they get corrupted by that power. So these kings, they worshipped false gods and goddesses and were not fair in their dealings with people. But we also read about some good kings, such as Hezekiah and Josiah. Nonetheless, because the kings and the people had broken their covenant with God so many times. Our God is a patient God, but there are consequences. So God allowed both kingdoms to be conquered because their kings were not making good choices. They were doing some big sins. So he allowed them to be conquered. Israel by the Assyrians and Judah by the Babylonians. I am in trouble, God. Listen to my prayer. I am afraid of my enemies. Save my life. After Judah was conquered, the Babylonians took many of the Israelites back to Babylon to live in slavery. This was called the Babylonian Exile, or just the exile, and it was a very sad time for the chosen people. God allowed this exile so his people could learn the importance of trusting in him and staying true to their covenant with him. After about 50 years, the Babylonians were conquered by the Persians, whose king allowed the Israelite slaves to return to the Promised Land and rebuild Jerusalem and their temple. The story of their return and rebuilding is told in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. As you can see, the books of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings tell us much about the history of God's chosen people after the Exodus. The historical writings in the Old Testament include other books that help flesh out the history of God's people. 1st and 2nd Chronicles provide different accounts of the history of the kings of Israel and Judah. The book of Tobit is a short story about the angel Raphael, a faithful Jew named Tobit, and Tobit's son Tobias search for a wife. The books of Ruth, Judith, and Esther tell us about brave women who helped the Jewish people. And 1st and 2nd Maccabees, the last of the historical books in the Old Testament, tell us about 5 brothers and their father who led a revolt against an evil Greek ruler after the Israelites returned from the exile. So there's a lot of history in the historical books. You're learning about the kings. You're learning about the important leaders. So the historical books are all about the important people and events that are happening during that time. Let's look at some of these fun facts and live it and think about it. So on page 58, it says, journal about your relationship with God. When you read the Old Testament, you encounter a long history of God's saving words and actions in the world. Today, God is present to you through the people and events in your own life. As a spiritual exercise, consider starting a journal to observe God's presence in your life. Is God present to everyone? Yeah. God is here for each and every one of us. It's your responsibility, your job to see when you see God in your life. So we put it away. So you need to be looking at, when have you seen God this morning? At the end of the day today, think to yourself, when did I see God today? Does it have to be some big wow moment? No. It could be in the smile somebody gave you. It could be in somebody picking up your paper when it fell on the ground and helping you out. It doesn't have to be a big thing. See God in the little moments. As a spiritual exercise, to begin by thinking back on your childhood and tell your story in terms of people or events that brought you closer to God. Continue writing in your journal every day or once a week to reflect on how God is present to you today. So think back to the bigger moments when you saw God in your life. And then as you keep going, think about, when did you see God in your everyday? Think about it. Look back at the 4 sections of the Old Testament that are introduced in this chapter. Which section most interests you after reading this overview? If you could pick one Old Testament book to begin reading today, which would it be and why? So something to think about. Page 60, the fun fact. When Moses asked God what his name is, God told Moses that his name is Yahweh, which means something like, I am. The Jewish people believe that God's name is too holy to speak out loud, so they say or write Lord instead. This is why many English language Bibles use the word Lord in all caps or small caps instead of the name Yahweh. Did you know the relationship between the Old and New Testaments? Another word for testament is covenant. So the Old Testament is about the covenant made by God with his chosen people at Mount Sinai. And the New Testament is about the covenant God made with all people through the saving work of Christ. But even the words of Old and New can be misleading. For Jesus said, do not think that I have come to do away with the law of Moses and the teachings of the prophets. I have not come to do away with them, but to make their teachings come true. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. So when you hear Old Testament, you might think an original covenant. And when you hear New Testament, you might think of fulfilled covenant. The Catechism of the Catholic Church quotes an old saying, the New Testament lies hidden in the Old, and the Old Testament is unveiled in the New. So they work together. It's not Old Testament is old, we don't need to think about it. Because it's old, we have the New Testament. New is better. That's not the way it works. The New Testament is hidden inside that Old Testament. If you read the Old Testament, you can see some foreshadowing. There's a religious word for it. I can't think of it off the top of my head, but foreshadowing of what's going to come in the New Testament. And the New Testament, it explains things from the Old Testament. So they work together. So with that, we are going to work on our true and false statements for the historical books. If it is a false statement, make it true. Correct the statement to make it true. So don't just write true or false. If it's a false statement, you need to go through and make it true. So go ahead and work on this, and our friends at home are going to have a wonderful rest of their day.